Great. So today's seminar is about the populist and far-right manipulations of history and culture. And this is basically the overarching research question of this paper and also my work a bit more broadly, namely, how does the populist far-right use the past? The more global rationale behind this approach of my research is, of course, that we see not only Germany and Europe globally the rise of the populist far-right, and we need explanations and trustworthy interpretations of this rise. What makes these actors so appealing to many voters, or in my case, to people to take to the streets in the context of social movements? So I want to contribute to this broader debates on the rise of the populist far-right by focusing on political culture, and specifically in this paper on memory, the uses of memory, and by moving the focus that most of the literature has the focus on party politics or even governmental politics. I would like to move this focus more towards grassroots mobilization, social movements, and activism. And well, I have this idea following also Kurt Hornen, for example, as I put here on the slide, that if we properly concentrate also on the symbol, the figural language that refers to cultural memory as it is seen by the radical right, we may also understand better the hidden logic behind this ideology, the emotional and aesthetic appeal that it has for many people. So as I said, both voters or social movement activists. And this paper, by the way, will hopefully be published soon-ish in the European Politics and Society Journal. So I am still in the process of reviewing and peer reviewing, and your comments will be very much appreciated to further work on this paper prior to publication. So the research strategy of this paper is basically what one might call a disciplined interpretative case study of a specific instance of far-right memory politics. So this Dresden-based far-right populist PEGIDA movement that I use as a lens in order to then hopefully also draw some broader conclusions about what populist uses of culture actually entail. So very briefly about PEGIDA. Richard already mentioned the entire name is so-called Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Occident. This movement is active since 2014, has also survived pandemic, and is currently also mobilizing and regularly taking to the streets. Its main or even only protest repertoire is the demonstration, regularly organized, always on Mondays, in Dresden, and for some time also outside of Dresden. By now, 6 years after inception of protests, it's mostly Dresden focused. This movement, or this maybe strictly speaking social movement organization, is set up by even less than 10 activists that organize protests, that speak, and that bring people together, and usually gathers around 2,000 participants. And why is this PEGIDA now an interesting case study for this purpose, of looking at populist mobilizations of the past? Well, I argue that it is extremely interesting because since the very beginning of its protest, it has been famous or infamous for using the past strategically, particularly the memory of the 1989 East German so-called peaceful revolution. So these mass protests in the fall of 1989 and the winter of 1990 that contributed to the demise of the communist GDR, or East Germany, and then preceded so-called German reunification. And you can already see, as I speak about a social movement, what I understand as memory politics is not memory laws or monuments here. When I now refer to memory politics, I actually speak of political uses of memory. And I put an emphasis on these semiotics or symbolic strategies that political actors adopt in order to construct collective action frames. This political approach kind of borrows both from political science and from social movement literature. So there's a kind of the theoretical ambition of this paper is also to somehow draw the literature from these two disciplines together. joined by a common instrumental vision of what political actors can do with memory and with the past. Yes, so memory and the past function here as an instrument for political actors. And this paper focuses on the strategies that political actors employ to make others remember in certain specific ways and the effects of these mnemonic manipulations. This is, of course, drawn from Kubik and Bernhard's theory of politics of memory. But also social movement scholars have been quite busy in looking at how movements and the past or movements and memory relate. And there is now a very new strand of thought, very interesting, that looks at how present movements use memory of movements or use the past more broadly for strategic framing of collective action, for framing identities, and to frame movement goals. And so how do I now proceed in this paper in terms of methodology? Basically, I conduct a mix of frame and discourse analysis of my own empirical data. So again, the overarching question is still how and why does PEGIDA use the past? And I decided that the best way how to gather data would be to look at what PEGIDA is actually doing. So I conducted a few months of ethnographic fieldwork in Dresden when it was still possible, just before the outset of the pandemic. So I participated in all PEGIDA's public protest events in the fall and winter of 2019 and 20, looked as well as communication on social media. And then I actually continued to also conduct some virtual ethnographic fieldwork once PEGIDA's public protest actually also moved to the virtual realm due to the pandemic condition. And I focused on historical symbolism that is used and displayed in PEGIDA's protest, both in terms of visuals, in terms of banners and flags, but also what is happening in terms of speech, in terms of discourse on stage. And I conducted, as I said, a mix of critical discourse and frame analysis. I will say a bit more about that later, focusing on these collective action frames that PEGIDA constructs. As well, very importantly, for a populist discourse that we all know is in its very essence antagonistic. So I also adopt this critical discourse analysis perspective to look at in-group and out-groups that are constructed in PEGIDA's public protest. And my argument is that all these discursive framing that PEGIDA is doing functions in and through memory. And now let me directly move to some of my findings. What I distill from this large amount of data is that even though the I in PEGIDA stands for Islamization, and PEGIDA is often understood as mostly an anti-immigration and anti-Islamic movement, this is actually not how PEGIDA organizers and also social movement activists or protesters, how they understand themselves. Their own master frame, so this kind of master narrative that they construct, is that they actually constitute a democratic resistance against totalitarianism. And this frame is built upon and through memory, especially in terms of how PEGIDA sees the contemporary political situation in Germany and Europe also more broadly, and how it then understands and identifies in that context. So PEGIDA diagnoses that contemporary Germany is actually not a democratic system anymore, but it has ceased to be a democracy. It does not safeguard civil rights anymore, but in practice resembles dictatorships. And now PEGIDA uses the memory or a symbolism referencing the GDR, so the communist East Germany and Nazi dictatorships, in order to underscore this relationship. This is the most important use of memory, so constant references to the GDR in order to denounce the contemporary German state of democracy, but also the institutions and the representatives in institutions as dictatorial and quasi-totalitarian. For example, here in a banner in public protest, this just visualize a bit how this parallel is struck, here using the acronyms of both GDR and contemporary Germany, which is in German BRD, kind of falling out of each other and constructing visually this parallel that actually this liberal democratic Germany of BRD or FRG in English. Sorry for this translation, a bit lost in translation. But this really constructs this parallel. And in that context, PEGIDA nevertheless, and much like other segments also of the German contemporary German far right, actually express a very hopeful prognostic frame, yeah, because democracy does not seem to be lost, because it can still be achieved or it can still be safeguarded by PEGIDA or other types of far right activism, like back then in 1989. So here again, the memory of the peaceful revolution that contributed to the demise of the GDR is taken in order to construct a hopeful and a hopeful prognostic frame. Just one example how PEGIDA puts that, for example, in a website entry, PEGIDA really constructs this parallel between PEGIDA activism and far right activism in Germany and peaceful revolutionary civil rights activists from 1989. So PEGIDA puts that the government today, yeah, like in GDR times, continuously sides against the majority of the people, but PEGIDA goes ahead in these times, and just like 28 years ago, looks like a regime will be toppled for the second time within one generation. And then PEGIDA uses here in red the most important historical slogan of the peaceful revolution, "We are the people," really directly comparing contemporary activism with past activism, and basically using this very positive memory of 1989 in order to give identity to demonstrators on the street. I already mentioned that for this, in this populist discourse, the construction of antagonistic categories, yeah, here on the one side we the people, and on the other side them the bad elites, is crucial. And this is also of course the case in PEGIDA. Interestingly, in PEGIDA it does not seem, the main opposition is not the people, the pure people, against for also immigrants, as for many other far-right movements. Of course, this also plays a role, but the main opposition is between PEGIDA as a reincarnation of past resistance movements and the elites that are the reincarnation of past totalitarian regimes. And PEGIDA uses, I already mentioned, the memory of 1989 in order to construct the movement itself as comparable or the same as past resistance movement, but also, and very controversially, it uses this flag that you see here on the slide that uses the same colors like the contemporary German flag, but in the form of a cross, looking a bit like Scandinavian national flags. This is the flag of the resistance against Nazism, or a resistance group against Nazism, that amongst others also this Stauffenberg attacker was also involved with. So this, in fact, very anti-totalitarian symbol is now appropriated by far-right populist PEGIDA in order to claim the memory and this basically positive heritage of resistance against dictatorship for themselves. And in turn, contemporary politicians, representatives, and especially, of course, Angela Merkel, are always put on the same level as past dictatorships, as past dictators from communist times, but also from Nazi Germany. So interestingly, and this is why this paper is entitled "Resisting Leftist Dictatorship," PEGIDA and also the broader German populist far right identifies contemporary German politics as being leftist dominated or green fascist. And so they reinterpret very controversially past dictatorships always as leftist. So while this might make sense for communist dictatorship in East Germany, this is of course much more difficult to construe in terms of Nazi Germany. But even here, through references to socialism in the Nazi party's name. Yeah? PEGIDA also mentions here to construe even Nazi Germany as a leftist dictatorship, and now to construe Angela Merkel and the entire German government and institutions as being in the tradition. Here also using this image of Red Sox, yeah, everybody from leftist parties like the left, Social Democrats and the Greens, but also the conservative Christian Democrats are here construed as left-wing parties that are letting in Islam. This is why we have this, this half moon, of course. And the slogan reads, "A turn in 1989." Actually, no, this is a mistake. So the elites as the major outgroup are construed as totalitarian, but it continues just as such. So counter demonstrators that are, of course, present in every PEGIDA protest are also construed as the opponents of democracy. Yeah, and again, using memory to sustain this image. So counter demonstrators are denounced as leftist green fascists, as non-democrats, and this long kind of fence that PEGIDA sometimes erects to here in this banner, basically of the German colors of the German flag, that constructs this barrier between protest and leftist counter-protest, is actually referred to as the anti-fascist protection wall. So taking again the memory of the GDR, which also referred to the inner German border as the so-called anti-fascist protection wall. So we have quite some weird twists in how memory is actually used. And finally, Muslims are of course portrayed as a threat to German culture, as is the case in most far-right populist discourse and movements in contemporary Europe. But it is again this democratic framing which PEGIDA tries to let dominate. Yeah, that Muslims are not only the threat to the culture, but they are actually violent warmongers and therefore a threat to German democracy as such. And again, PEGIDA doesn't say just like this, but uses memory to sustain this discourse. For example, Martin Luther, here is also his face on this picture that I took from a bit far away, so the quality is not the best. So here again, Martin Luther as a very positively remembered figure in Germany as a whole, but Eastern Germany in particular, is used in order to sustain contemporary political goals. I believe, yes. Thank you, Richard, for the reminder. So just very briefly, what I am taking from this analysis: 2 claims. First, I would like to claim that this antagonistic logic of populism, so we against the other, we the people against them, the elites, etc., is actually a better explanation for the mechanisms in PEGIDA's uses of memory than would be the inequality doctrine of far-right ideology. And I think this is important for us as populism scholars, that sometimes are of course criticized for overusing maybe this concept by not being analytically clear. And there is of course the claim to only use the lens of far right. But I would say that this analysis of memory, uses of memory in PEGIDA, really shows that we need this lens in order to understand how memory is strategically used. And second, I would also like to claim, having spent quite some time, sometimes I think too much time in PEGIDA, that this use of memory, this use of culture and of historical elements are actually a key element to understand both the emergence, but especially also the persistence of PEGIDA's protest mobilization as such. Basically, when I went to Dresden, and still now, people are always surprised that PEGIDA is even still existing. Many media observers and political observers and scholars had predicted its demise already years ago. And still PEGIDA is still existing, still now, and still even after so many months of pandemic, and is taking to the streets at more or less bi-weekly rhythm. I would say, and I follow a recent article by Thompson in the Social Movement Studies Journal, that he puts it, when arranged and in deliberate sequences and incorporated into broader mobilization frameworks, historical citations can prompt constituencies to assume responsibility for history itself. And I would interpret that this is going on in this very movement, that actually this controversial use of the past is helping PEGIDA to stay on the streets, because this conviction that one has to take to the street, like back then in 1989, to combat a leftist dictatorship is so strong, as it keeps PEGIDA alive, even though it has very few alternative resources. This is all from me. Maybe an open question for later could be also about societal responses to these populist far-right mobilizations of the past, but this I will leave to you, of course. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to 2 more talks as well. Thank you.